So it's brilliant that this action is happening at WITS, the first university in South Africa, joining, I think now close to 200 universities around the world. And I have no doubt that other universities in South Africa will join them. But once again, WITS students are trailblazing. And so we have a tight program. I've been given a script by Melanie in consultation with others. I'm not going to stick to the script, but just to say that when we heard David and Jill will be coming to visit us, many of us immediately felt strongly that we need to engage with her and her recent writings, particularly because we read, and I'm not sure if everybody has a copy, but it's fairly easy to get hold of in Antipode. It's The Progeny of Empire, Defining Moments of Nation Formation in South Africa and Palestine, Israel. But Jill was quite clear that she wants to have an engagement with activists, many of whom are in the encampment, but you will. Some of us are here. And so she wants to steer the discussion to Praxis. So the topic that she'll be speaking to is South Africa and Palestine in an imperial frame, implications for Praxis. So this part I'll read out, Melanie. The objectives of this event, I'm only reading it out because I totally agree with it, and it summarizes what I was agonizing about, is to stimulate discussion and debate on the difference it could, should, does make to strategy, tactics, and building solidarity to end the genocide and advance Palestinian liberation if we move beyond the apartheid analogy and to include a focus on the intertwined histories of imperialism in South Africa and Palestine. I mean, many of us have been non-stop busy in this room and outside, particularly people like Rohan, our commander-in-chief. Those of you who went to the global conference would see her in action, but even prior to that, we've had demonstrations and lots of pickets and actions. And I think reflecting on this, thinking about this more deeply is something we have to do because it will inform our tactics and strategy and mobilization going forward. So I must also thank everybody who rallied together, which is fantastic. I hope I don't leave anybody out, but we can mention their name later on. Lindiwe, Tasneem, Prishani, and I think Dorothea from SWAP. Melanie from UJ Sociology, Noor from the History Workshop. He can't join us because he's giving a teach-in at the University of Western Cape with other friends. Of course, Bridget from Sociology at WITS. And, you know, Tara, Wineberg, and Rohan, Dadoo, at very short notice, very graciously, actually there was a bit of arm twisting, agreed to be respondents. So, there's so much to say about Jill, and she's been an inspiration and has influenced us for a long, long time. But I think for people to know that she is affiliated to SWAP and the Department of Geography at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm going to resist the temptation to be an Imbongi praise singer, but just suffice to say that her books, which have been very influential, I'll mention a few, Disabling Globalization, Places of Power in Post-Apartheid South Africa, Gramsci, Space, Nature and Politics, and Rethinking the South African Crisis, Nationalism, Populism, Hegemony, have had really a profound scholarly influence on many of us. Tara Wineberg is a lecturer at the History Department here, is a member of the South African Jews for Free Palestine, SAJFP, and Wits University Palestine Action Committee, WUPAC. Rohan Dadoo is the coordinator of the South African BDS Coalition and the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. There's, of course, a lot other things I can talk about, the work in COMSA with migrants and refugees, and your stint in Durko, posted to Algeria. But I'll stop there. So Jill will talk for about 30 minutes. Tara will start and a few brief comments, and then followed by Rohan, and then we'll have a discussion. So please go ahead, Jill, and let's give Jill a round of applause. But just before Jill, I'm sorry about this, Jill. I mean, I'm not going to explain what we all know about the scholasticide. Some call it scholasticide, some call it educide. We're talking about over 5,000 students who have been killed, close to 100 full professors, and I understand 4 presidents or vice-chancellors of universities. 12 universities have been destroyed. Over 450 schools have been bombed. They've targeted libraries, printing presses, the Central Archives and other archives. And, scholasticide, which is a term coined by Kama Nabulsi at Oxford University, a Palestinian scholar, many years ago, because this has been an incremental genocide. And the second Nakba, which has never stopped from the first one in 47, 48. And the first thing at the time of the establishment of the State of Israel, and just before that, all the literature, the books were looted, actually. Tens of thousands of books, and that was the beginning of the scholasticide. But I think that it's only fitting, before we start, to have a moment of silence and perhaps for us to stand before Jill speaks, for our colleagues and others. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Jill.
So thank you so much, Salim. And I really appreciate the way you framed your framing of this in terms of our being powerfully cognizant of the terrible, terrible violence going on. And it really was, it was Salim who is to blame for this lecture. Because he very quickly sort of said, invited me to give a talk, and I want to come back to some of the work that Salim and Rohan and others have been doing. But just quickly, I also want to express my great appreciation to Prashani for very quickly offering SWAP as the sponsoring institution, to Tasneem and Simon and Lindy, who've all done, incredible amounts of work on pulling this up, to Dorothy for doing the poster, to Melanie and Bridget, who have just been wonderful sources of support, and I appreciate both of them more than I can say. And very much many thanks to both Tara and Rohan for agreeing to have their arms twisted. So thank you all so much. So, it's really great to be back in a civilized country. We got back from California on the 3rd of May, and it makes such a difference to be in a country with widespread majority support for freedom in Palestine. And it's very important. And, I think this, for us last week, was exemplified by these two very important events that Salim and Rohan have been involved in. The Shireen Abu Akleh Memorial Lecture at UJ, which was incredibly powerful and moving. And also the vitally important Global Anti-Apartheid Conference on Palestine that they convened. And, one of the things that was very striking to me is how Palestinians visiting South Africa have made clear the significance of South African support and the central political importance of apartheid in Palestinian struggles. And here I think it's important to recognize sort of two dimensions of the way apartheid has sort of functioned. The one is as a crime under international law, which is the definition that BDS uses. And then, of course, there's the whole question of the apartheid analogy, with comparative studies of South Africa and Palestine, Israel. Now, while recognizing and appreciating all this work that's been done on apartheid in terms of the relationship between South Africa and Palestine, Israel, what I want to argue here is that what we share with Palestinians is not just apartheid, but much longer, deeper imperial histories through which we were both forged as nations. And what I want to argue is that both South Africa and Palestine have taken shape as creatures of British imperialism since the 19th century, through processes of settler colonialism and racialized dispossession that are not separate. In fact, what I really want to emphasize is that these processes are historically and continue to be deeply interconnected. And to suggest that these interconnections actually really matter. So I want to also pose the so what question. Why, if at all, do these interconnected imperial histories matter? And, just for starters, I want to suggest three main points. That first of all, it seems to me that this longer historical understanding is very helpful in detonating, and I'm not using disentangling, I'm using detonating, widespread claims that any critique of Zionism or Israel is necessarily and by definition anti-Semitic. And this is very important because, as I'm sure many of you know, in response to the rise of BDS after 2005, but especially after 2009, Israel's Ministry of Strategic Affairs really transformed itself into a propaganda machine in order to cement the claim, as the boss puts it, that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are the same lady in a different cloak. And I think the gendered character of this claim, speaks volumes. But that I want to suggest as we go along how this deeper historical interconnected understanding really helps to blow apart those and reframe those claims. So secondly, I think what it also does is it really forces us to pay close attention to how both Europe and North America have been and remain very deeply implicated in the horror unfolding in Palestine, both in the past and in the present. And thirdly, I want to suggest that since the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and the Balfour Declaration was this Lord Alfred Balfour basically giving Palestine to the Zionist movement. That since then, Palestinians have been forced to pay for the crimes of European and North American anti-Semitism. So those are, it seems to me, sort of three ways in which I see these longer histories as actually mattering in the present. So what I'm going to do in 25 minutes or less, I hope, is two steps. One, what I want to try to do is summarize some of the more specific insights that I think grow out of these deeper imperial histories, but then open up for discussion about the political work that these sorts of insights might do in the present. So the way I'm going to do it is to suggest how South Africa and Palestine were formed as nations through these interconnected imperial processes in three key historical periods. So first is the rise of Britain as a major imperial and industrial power since the early 19th century, following the Age of Revolution, and here to include the American, French, and very importantly also the Haitian revolutions and the Napoleonic Wars. And what's important here is that after Britain was chucked out of the United States as part of the American Revolution, what they moved very quickly to do was take over India, where a number of other colonial powers were sort of parked all over India. And what the Brits did by 1918 was they totally took over India, which was, of course, the absolute core of British imperial power, and closely linked in many ways to the empire of cotton, to the rise of the Industrial Revolution. So Britain's interest in both Southern Africa and Palestine was first and foremost geopolitical and strategic. So first of all, the Brits, as we all know, took over the Cape Colony from the Dutch in 1806, first and foremost to ensure the sea passage to India. But at exactly the same time, Britain became very interested in Palestine as part of the land bridge to India. And what they were most concerned about was to take advantage of the instability of the Ottoman Empire at the time. And in this project of sort of taking advantage of the instability of the Ottoman Empire was very closely tied in with the rise of Christian Zionism as a political project in Britain, as a political movement in 19th century Britain. And this form of Christian Zionism predated Jewish Zionism quite significantly, and was really part of a project to send Jews to Palestine. And in the late 19th century, with growing anti-Semitism and Jewish pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe, this, of course, led to vast increases in Jewish immigration, part of it into Britain, and the ramping up of both Christian and Jewish Zionism in relation to one another. So in 1905, then Prime Minister Arthur Balfour of the Balfour Declaration passed the Aliens Act to restrict Jewish immigration to Britain. The Balfour Declaration in 1917 was very much the work of Balfour and other Christian Zionists, including, very importantly, Lloyd George, who became Prime Minister in 1916 in the middle of World War I. So these Christian Zionists were, and it was a partly a sort of serendipitous process through which the Christian Zionists came into power in the British, it took over power in Britain. But this is what led directly to the Balfour Declaration. But the Balfour Declaration, I'm going to argue, was also very tightly connected with South Africa through the central role of Lord Alfred Milner and his assistants. And when I made this discovery, I remember running to David and saying, I found the smoking gun. This is, I had this deep sense of an important connection. But Milner and his so-called kindergarten were really the smoking gun in this process. So what I want to do now is turn to a second key period of nation formation, which the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, and of course the Balfour Declaration in 1917. So nation formation in the age of empire, World War I. Milner, as we know, Lord Alfred Milner was the British High Commissioner in South Africa from 1897 to 1905, i.e. before, during, and immediately after the Anglo-Boer South African War. He was part of a group of British liberals who worked very closely in alliance with mining capital to ensure cheap black labor. And of course, the Natives Land Act of 1913 was a very important product of this collaboration. But it's also important to realize that Milner was instrumental in the rise of new forms of segregation and scientific racism that were sort of moving around the world at the time and were very important in the US, and there were many direct connections with the US through all of this. But when Milner left South Africa in 1905, his so-called kindergarten took over. And Milner's kindergarten was a bunch of young Oxford-educated liberals whose primary concern in the period leading up to 1910 was how to reconcile Boers and Brits. And of course, what this whole process of reconciliation turned crucially about was building a white nationalism that was strong enough to resist African political activism. And so these processes of racialized dispossession and of settler and the cementing of settler colonialism were very much part of this project that was not by any means limited to Milner, but he was certainly a leading figure in all of this. Now, the big argument that I tried to lay out in the Progeny of Empire paper was that the practical involvement of Milner and his kindergarten in forging a seemingly, quote unquote, successful settler colonial nation in South Africa in the first decade of the 20th century was very deeply connected with the Balfour Declaration and its aftermath. And a key imperial transmission point in this process between South Africa and Palestine was the so-called Round Table. The Round Table was formed by Milner's kindergarten after 1910, when they went back to London. And it was, in effect, a think tank. And it's been called an informal brains trust, in which South Africa represented for these guys, as Paul Rich has pointed out, an absolutely fascinating laboratory for experimenting with new forms of imperial government. So they very actively saw South Africa as a sort of a blueprint that could then be used in other parts of the world. So when Lloyd George became Prime Minister in 1916, he brought Milner into his war cabinet along with Jan Smuts. But it's also the case that many members of the Round Table, many of whom also held strategic positions in the Lloyd George administration, and played an absolutely central role in the Balfour Declaration, in the mandate, the British mandate, which over Palestine, that was formulated in close association with the Zionist movement, and in promoting pro-Zionist policies in Palestine after World War I. Now, the sort of key argument that I'm making here is that these South African connections are absolutely crucial to grasping the racialized practices and processes of dispossession, exclusion, and settler colonial nation formation in Palestine in the interwar years that led up to the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. Now, another key sort of conjuncture is the interwar years, which in the paper I don't have space to go into. But something that in stuff that I'm working on, I want to elaborate, is that there were very interesting dynamics at play in both South Africa and Palestine during the interwar period. One of these, especially by the 1930s, was an explosion of multiple antagonisms of both Black South Africans and Palestinians to settler colonial rule. The other, I think, very important and significant process that was not just in South Africa and Palestine, but was the rise and consolidation of racially, religiously defined fundamentalist forms of nationalism. So I think it's really crucial that we see Zionism as part of an extended family of religious nationalisms, which include, of course, the rise of the Broederbond in South Africa, which really consolidated in the 1930s and paved the way for apartheid. But this was also the period in which, the 20s and 30s, in which Hindutva was taking hold in India. It was also the period in which the particular forms of white evangelical religious nationalisms that form an important part of the Trump base were also in formation during this period. And one of the things that's actually really interesting is how in the mid-1970s, in the midst of massive global political economic crisis, these fundamentalist religious nationalisms reappear in many different parts of the world. So I think that this whole issue of understanding Zionism in this broader historical frame is really important. And where I think this is really important in the present is it also brings into vision Christian nationalism in relation to these other forms of Christian Zionism in relation to these other forms of nationalism. And you know what we've seen historically, of course, with the Balfour Declaration and with the Aliens Act of 1905, is that anti-Semitism and pro-Zionism have worked together very closely historically, and they actually continue to do so. So, you know, the likes of Elon Musk and Steve Bannon are deeply beloved by Benjamin Netanyahu. Yeah? And they, you know, are quite openly anti-Semitic, at the same time very strongly pro-Zionist. And it seems to me that this kind of recognition is really important to those who try and show that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are the I better censor my language a bit, but the nonsense about, you know, the same lady with different cloaks. And it seems to me the other thing that's really important for us to sort of build on and recognize in the present is that Zionism, that Zionism was not peculiar in the interwar period. What did make Zionism peculiar was, of course, the Holocaust. But what's also really important to recognize is that anti-Semitic, the Holocaust went hand in hand with anti-Semitic restrictions on immigration into both Britain and the US. And in the US, the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act was very powerful in limiting Jewish immigration. There's been some very interesting work done by a guy by the name of David Nassau, in which he shows how in the years immediately following World War II, the US and other governmental signatories of the International Refugee Association considered Jewish survivors of the Holocaust too damaged, too clannish, too dangerous, and either incapable or unwilling to do the hard work required of them. That is a quote. And many Holocaust survivors were also denied entry, especially into the US, on grounds of being communist sympathizers. And these restrictions, it seems to me, are really a powerful, powerful reminder of how deeply implicated Euro-America has been and continues to be in the violence engulfing Palestine and Israel. But you know, in conclusion, I think that we also need to keep absolutely front and center are how the histories of how Palestinians have in effect been called upon, indeed forced, to pay the vast bulk of the costs of Euro-American anti-Semitism. And that what this sort of recognition does, and I think placing that front and center, is it provides a leverage, it seems to me, to argue for massive reparations as the basis for any hopeful rebuilding of Palestine when this terrible war is over. So thank you.
As we wait for Tara to come forward, I just want to say that we have some very special friends, guests here. I mean, all of you are special, but we we have young Salma right at the back there. We have her mum, Lara, and next to her Samer, as well as Isaac. They all do brilliant work. Lara is also a colleague at one of the universities in California. And Isaac has done great work in the union movement as well as with prisoners in education. And of course, Sama is a techie we got to know about. So welcome. We really, they've also been involved with blocking the boat Zim line very successfully and stopping this military ship from leaving, etc. So incredibly courageous and wonderful people. I mean, that was such a fantastic paper, but I'm not going to say anything because the respondents are here and people will have lots of questions, but it speaks to some of the things we were considering at the global conference, and some of which, including reparation and the right to return, that made it into this declaration as well. But we'll chat about that later. Tara, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Swap. It's great to be able to respond to such an interesting paper by Jill after having read your work for many, many years. It's also particularly, the timing is good in that I'm teaching the first year core history course at the moment. And we begin that course in global history with the Haitian Revolution and the Age of Revolutions. And we end on Thursday with the history of Palestine in global context. So thinking about different forms of resistance over the last 300 years and also different forms of, or in some ways continuing forms of imperialism over the last 300 years. So it's given me a lot to think about, and I may steal some ideas for the Thursday lecture as well, if that's okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about land and property issues as part of settler colonialism. And in particular, I was struck by a passage from a book by the historian Ilan Pape recently, whose work I was reading in preparation actually for this Palestine lecture for the first year students. And it really resonated with my experience of South African cities and South African universities. So I want to just offer a quote that's from the introduction of his book, A History of Modern Palestine. And he says, quote, "From my classroom at Haifa University, up on the Carmel Mountains, there is seldom a clear view of the city below. On a rare day when smog and pollution are miraculously absent, I can see the Jewish and Palestinian neighborhoods of Haifa. Socioeconomic well-being is closely entwined with national and ethnic affiliations and topography. This forms a pyramid which encapsulates the stratification of Israeli society, and more importantly, the history of the land. Given this geographical polity, it is not surprising to find the university at the top of the mountain, marked by a tower and 30 stories, and overlooking the Palestinians, Mizrahi Jews, and the less fortunate socioeconomic classes of the town. Like all other national institutions in Israel, the community of Haifa University is predominantly Jewish, European, and middle class," end quote. And reading this, it struck me how this Pape here could well be describing a university in South Africa, a university like Wits or a university like UCT, situated on the top of a hill, looking down upon these highly segregated and unequal cities shaped by colonialism and apartheid. So both Palestine and South Africa have these legacies and in many ways realities of settler colonialism and racial capitalism, accompanied by the accumulation of property and particularly land by white settlers. Another book that I've been reading recently by Andy Clarno also compares South Africa and Palestine, and he has this quote that I wanted to also read out. He says, "Dispossessing people of their land and resources is not merely a precursor to capitalism, but rather a constant normal strategy of capital accumulation, from the English commons and the conquest of the Americas to the Iraqi oil fields and the privatization of public goods," end quote. A couple of months ago, we had a couple visiting from Palestine. Fatih Nimer was one of those who was here with South African Jews for a Free Palestine and was also hosted for a couple of teach-ins here at WITS. And he's one of the founders of a network called Decolonize Palestine, and is also a fellow of the Palestine Policy Network. And he's been doing a lot of work on the history of urban inequality in Jerusalem. And it was chilling hearing him speak about things like racial covenants in housing practices in cities like Jerusalem, which have resonance not only in South Africa in terms of the Group Areas Act, for example, but also in the United States and the history of Jim Crow there, and even beyond Jim Crow, the continuing existence of racial discrimination in housing practices and rental markets. He described Palestinians' exclusion from housing and property, and it was really, as I said, it was really chilling how resonant this was when thinking about South Africa. Others have also described how in Palestine there is a kind of farm crisis south of Jerusalem for Palestinian farmers, where farmers are frozen out of the market, Palestinian farmers, and have been for the last 100 years or so, since the time of the British Mandate, really, and not dissimilar from the way in which Black South African farmers were frozen out of the market here, both during the period of British colonization, under the Union government in South Africa, and also under apartheid. And in both of these places, too, people have waged struggles against structural inequalities wrought by settler colonialism, have fought for the more just distribution of property, including land and housing, and in both places these struggles are ongoing. So now I want to come to the question of, I guess, pose a few questions around praxis, and I'm curious to hear, the question of reparations and other ways of thinking about building solidarity, genuine solidarity across South Africa, Palestine, and globally that could lead to action. So South Africa has the land restitution program, which has been in place since 1994, but it's limited, it's narrow, it's slow. Cities and the countryside in South Africa remain highly segregated, highly unequal. I think of, for example, the terrible fire in that building in Joburg last year in an occupied building. And so land reform on a broader level does not really seem forthcoming from the state. It seems to require massive movements to demand it and force the state to act on it. One of the ways in which movements in South Africa have been trying to push for politics of land redistribution and land distribution has been through land occupations and building occupations. And it's interesting here that, I think in the South African sense, the word occupation conveys a radical politics of claiming land from which people were dispossessed. Whereas the way that I think of occupation in the Palestine context is the occupied territories. So it's a settler population occupying Palestinian land. So I wonder to what extent a politics of occupation, of reoccupation in Palestine would be possible. In South Africa, movements like Abahlali have been leading the charge in terms of the politics of land occupation, but even in South Africa, the politics of land occupation remains largely on the margins as a way of claim making. Mostly people still go via the state in terms of signing up for restitution claims, waiting on housing lists, and so on. And so where do the possibilities maybe lie in Palestine, where there is also such intense land and housing inequality? How might it be possible to build a coalition globally to respond to these similar dynamics across South Africa and Palestine? And that I think also speaks to your question in the paper around solidarity at this particular conjuncture and what it might look like. So even if there are mass movements in South Africa, we need them in other parts of the world too. Workers to stop unloading Israeli goods, understandings of dispossession of land and property as a global imperial phenomenon, one where we, as you suggest, understand the links between places like South Africa, the US, Palestine, India. And so I guess I'm asking a question about what kind of politics of solidarity might be possible, in particular around land and property. Thanks.
I don't know why I agreed to this. I can't say all those kind of clever things. I don't really know what to say. I mean, I suppose as activists, the framing of apartheid is a way of mobilizing people, but it's, and trying to make some of those analogies around segregation, dispossession, and so on, but also it's limited because international law is limited, and it's limited because it was made by Western imperialists for them. So obviously we know there's a limitation, but it's still useful because I think now we're reaching the limits of pushing. In fact, the ICJ case, I think, is testing the limits of international law, because it's really a country like South Africa who, as a government, is using the apartheid analogy, which took it 20 years or more to actually adopt, but now, once it did, it's making good use of it in that sense, to test as a global South country how you can push the boundaries and how you can show up, in effect, the limits of international law. And so therefore they're looking at the imperialist, the way in which Zionism is not a product, what's the word? It's like not an outcome. It's part of Western imperialism, means that you can obviously go beyond the apartheid analogy. What that means for activists, I don't know really. In the global conference, I suppose from 2001 in Durban, when the apartheid label was first really taken up by civil society, including Palestinians who were there from all the parts of Palestine, and that was a big fight in the civil society conference, to now when we've just had this global anti-apartheid conference. In a way, the sort of imperialism framework is pushing beyond the apartheid label, but that can go in many ways. It doesn't necessarily mean that the solidarity movement is going to go in a progressive way, and I think we have to understand what this means and fight for space within that, because, as you said, of the way in which the religious zealotry around both, I thought it was very interesting, the Christian Zionism coming way before the State of Israel, because it was much more recently that the State of Israel has taken hold of it consciously, and now that's one of the biggest challenges to building solidarity in South Africa and in the continent. But other religious zealotries, such as Islamic religious zealotry, and some of the very unprogressive ideas behind that, is also a reality. And I think if we remember the Iranian Revolution, what's happened there in the aftermath maybe should not be so easily forgotten for people on the left, and progressive, in fact, clerics as well. So I think, there's a sort of positive, you could see a positive, progressive way in which solidarity movement could be moving beyond the apartheid framework in the case of Palestine and looking at, an anti-imperialist movement. And these issues did come up in the conference. But also, I think there are cautions around how we've tried to find a way to maintain a progressive political international solidarity. That's it.
Thanks, Roshan. Those were very, very important points. And I think we'll discuss all of this fully. But perhaps, Jill, do you want to take the first, or shall we just open it up? Whatever you prefer.
Why don't we just open it?
Open it up, right.
Yeah.
Okay, I see a forest of hands shooting up. While you're thinking, I can continue talking. Well, you know, there's a Hebrew word for apartheid. It's called hafrada. And it's a word that talks about segregating Palestinians from Jewish people. And somebody who discussed this was Jeff Holper, in this very room, actually, when he came to give a guest lecture. It's quite fascinating, the history. But I think beyond that, recent reports, for example, Francesca Albanese's report, questioning the appropriateness of the apartheid analogy, differently from what Jill has said, but importantly spoke to settler colonialism. And the reason she mentioned that is that you have to go to the source, and you have to speak to, not in as many words as Jill, but, you know, in a sense, the original sin of imperialism, the establishment of the State of Israel, and the particular role it's always played as a font of reaction, doing the bidding of empire from the outset. So, you know, we also managed to get this phrase in, and I think Jill will be happy with that, in the declaration, which says something like, from Balfour to Biden, which shows the connection. So, I mean, I think a lot of people here know that Israel, since its establishment, has played a particular role, initially to keep the region safe for oil companies, and then supporting the Central American dictatorships, military dictatorships, South American military dictatorships, involvement in supporting the suppression of Turkish workers, you know, and I can go on. Around the world, it's incredible. I mean, apart from their complicity in our oppression in this country, it's also training repressive forces around the world, including the American police who are beating up students. You know, they've played that particular role, and of course, again, books like Lowenstein's book, The Palestine Laboratory, or Jeff Holper's War on the People, the particular niche it has in the global economy around surveillance, high-tech security, and it, you know, testing the weaponry on the bodies of Palestinian men, women, and children, and using that to market it as a success to the world. You know, so they play that role. I mean, you remember Biden, you might have come across this when he was a senator, when Israel invaded Lebanon in the early 80s. He made this remark: if Israel didn't exist, we would have had to create a Israel. So I think those issues, so that's given you enough time. And I see one hand. Tasneem, please go ahead.
Sorry, I'm reading a comment from the live stream.
Yes, thanks.
It's from Robert Krieger, I think. High-tech AI and geospatial intelligence are the cornerstones of contemporary hegemonic practices of empire and its lackeys in suppressing resistance, not only in Palestine, but also against the encampments across the globe. Which avenues are open to civil society to obviate and utilize similar methods?
Thanks. We'll take a few. I saw Lara at the back. No. Lara, Iskander, and then Dale.
Thank you for allowing us to be here as visitors and guests. I wanted to, it was really interesting to hear your arguments, because it's like, yeah, of course, right? We know that these are imperial projects, but never have we thought about this as a way actually to move it beyond the question of apartheid. And as somebody who organizes in the United States, we've always understood Israel as a proxy to US imperialism and have often organized our movement in that way and known that there's actually a limitation as organizers and activists in doing so, because people don't understand imperialism. So when you use the term even imperialism, it doesn't make sense, and we would often do a lot of political education on this topic. And this moment, it makes me wonder how opportune it is, because of how obvious this war is a US war in addition to a Western war. It wouldn't be, this Gaza would not be continued to be bombed had it not been for Biden, right? The Balfour to Biden piece. So I guess a question to pose is, given the interconnectedness of apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel, what, from those of you who fought in the case of apartheid South Africa, what opportunities or lessons are there for us as anti-imperialists in how we organize and fight? Like, what are things that we should, given how things played out here in South Africa, and if we understand now how deeply connected the root causes of these systems are, what is there for us to take into account in the work that we're doing? And are there lessons to draw from?
Thanks. Summer.
Sorry, I was just going to add one tiny piece to that. Also, thank you, fascinating talk. And hopefully when you're back in the Bay Area, we'd love to talk to you more when we're collectively in uncivilized territory together. I just wanted to piggyback a little bit on what Lada was saying, to ask if you can just kind of speak to I think you brought up a really fascinating contradiction in our work of this idea that we constantly have to sort of single out Zionism as being this particularly malicious ideology that's grounded in a sort of violent, racialized understanding of the world. And we're frequently pilloried for that exact thing, right? Like, why are you singling out Israel? Whereas I think the reason that we do that, and I think you explained this really well, is not because of Zionism's idiosyncrasy, but its universality, right? Like how it relates to all these other things. But the way to marry those two things is tricky, right? It's like discursively hard. So I'm wondering if you can like speak to that directly.
Shall I take a few more? Or do you just go ahead? Yes. Yeah.
I was also wondering, when somebody raises an issue that somebody else would like to respond to, so that it's not sort of Q&A.
Yeah.
If we could make it a more
and
dialogical.
also, right, and the respondents, you welcome to chip in as well. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Go ahead.
All right. So thank you very much, Prof. Hart. I'm very...
Jill.
Sorry?
Jill.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Jill. Yeah, I'm very happy that I perchance ended up in your talk today. I really, really appreciated your talk and many of the connections that you were making with the British Empire, and especially around religion and race. Yeah, I found it very insightful, and I would really love to read, if you're publishing on this, I'd really love to read your work. I also happen to work on religion, race, and resistance, and I'm working on an article now around the Crusades in Palestine. And I think some of it relates to what you shared around Western Empire. Just some things I'm finding in terms of research. We're basically dealing with millennia, 10 centuries, where there has been a constant attempt to colonize Palestine by the West. Initially Western Christendom, and then the modern West, up until this moment. So that's really interesting, especially around questions of race and religion. I'm also finding, I mean, in my opinion, Palestine is, it is really the beginning of Western imperialism. I mean, if we look at kind of symbolic figures like Columbus or Da Gama, just as representations, both of them had in mind reconquering the Holy Land. And they brought the entire logic of medieval Christendom with them, of anyone who's a non-white and non-Christian, you know, deserves to be conquested and colonized. So I found many resonances in your talk in terms of what I'm also researching, and I just wanted to share that.
Could you give your name?
Iskander.
Iskander.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you're about to graduate or about to hand in your thesis at UJ. Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. Both in your talk as well as in the respondents, to me there's a conundrum here. And this has always faced progressive activists in the global south, I think particularly, which is, and you spoke to this, which is on the one hand an anti-imperialist politics that recognizes all of that history and that progeny. And the other side of that progeny is the sub-imperialisms, the situations where in a Zimbabwe, where in a Mozambique, where in an Angola, you have, in the post-independence periods, you have situations where you have authoritarian dictatorships, where you have it in Saudi Arabia, where you have it in Iran, where you have it in India, all the different colonies and everything, where a declared anti-imperialism and a practical authoritarianism, which then suppresses its own people in the name of an anti-imperialism. And this is the conundrum that faced many people in this country with what happened in Zimbabwe with Mugabe. I'm just giving a local example. One can talk about right now, as Iran was raining down missiles on Israel, they were arresting and killing women who were for not wearing enough of a veil on their heads, according to the morality police. So and you see it in India, you see it everywhere. It seems to me that oftentimes the way in which the Zionists are able to dismiss a lot of progressive critique is precisely because they can point to the fact that, Netanyahu and the rest of them say, well, we're a democracy. You guys are authoritarian. You have no elections. You have no nothing, and yet you're trying to lecture us on democracy. They can use that. But at the same time here, I think there's a rhetorical anti-imperialism that's very strong. In other words, it's very easy, it's very easy for the ANC and the Lady Pandor to get up on a platform right now and to speak about pro-Palestinian and having a moral high ground and looking at it's very, very difficult for her to say anything about Swaziland, which Cyril Ramaphosa just visited last week. We were with Swaziland comrades who were shot and killed, 150 of them within the last 2 years, by the very regime that is supporting them. And yet there's absolutely nothing that's being said. So it's not about whataboutism, it's about how do progressive activists begin to try to cross these boundaries of authoritarian politics at the local level and at the national level of declared anti-imperialists, which then divide a lot of the progressive movement, because on the one, and this is what's happened in South Africa, a lot of the anti-apartheid people refused to see the ANC for the neoliberal and authoritarian force it was in the early 1990s, and refused to support local activists who were dissenting, and you were getting smashed. 20 years later, everybody's like, that's what happened over the last 30 years. Okay, and so I'm looking now as this is unfolding in Palestine and unfolding here, how do, that's the question for all of us, because we can be caught on the wrong side of history in our understandable zeal to be anti-imperialist and to point out the bugbear, to then to turn a blind eye to what is happening to actual activists, and particularly women activists in the Middle East.
Okay, Jairaj, but perhaps we can get a discussion, and then we'll come back to you the next round. Go ahead. Did you want to comment on one of the things that, or did you want to bring in a separate point? Oh, okay. Go ahead, yeah.
I think the apartheid framework is precisely, and it's in the article, the way in which you refute the claim that Israel's a democratic state. It isn't. It's an apartheid state. It's now not only a settler colonial apartheid state, but a genocidal state. So it's, that's out of the question that there's, that it can get away with this idea that it's the only democracy in the Middle East. And I also think, that other examples, that there, in the terms of the question of Palestine, it does become whataboutery to some extent, but also to remember, because if you think of it as this kind of, I think it was fundamental, the word I missed, Zionism is fundamental in the whole project of British and then American imperialism. If your vice chancellor says, well, what about Sudan? What about DRC? What's fueling those wars? It's totally directly is Israel. It's weapons, it's that question of surveillance equipments, it's the meddling about in the DRC with mineral resources, and in Zimbabwe, actually. So Israel is very directly destabilizing countries and very directly propping up authoritarian regimes in our continent.
Tara, would you like to come in before Jill? Please travel well. Thanks for visiting. Lovely. Okay. Oh, okay. All right. Go ahead, Tara.
Just a brief point in response to your question. So I was at a talk by Ruth Wilson Gilmore a couple of months ago where she was asked a similar question about the hypocrisy of the South African government, that its willingness to speak out and speak a really, like an excellent radical, kind of accountable position on Palestine. But when it comes to issues of education inequality, housing inequality, it's not willing to respond to local activists in the same way. And her response was interesting. She was like, yes, I agree, but maybe that's an opening that movements can use to demand, to hold the government to account. So to hold someone like Naledi Pandor to account along those lines of saying, well, be consistent in your commitment to socioeconomic justice. So I think there's a mismatch there for sure, but there's also an opportunity for organizing, possibly.
I think the point that Tara raised is hugely important, of the idea of using this mismatch between, and actually wonderful speech that Naledi Pandor gave at the Shireen Abu Akleh lecture, as you say, and all the horror that goes on around poverty, inequality, suppression of protest. So yeah, I think that's exactly an example of how Joe Bluin gave a wonderful talk, South African Jews for a Free Palestine, on the importance of connecting different struggles. And the example of how we, precisely the question of how we might use this disconnect between discursive anti-imperialism and practical authoritarianism is actually a really interesting issue. And, it also speaks to the way in which the struggles going on in Palestine can actually help us, which seems to me a very important sort of dimension of this whole thing. So I think what the discussion so far, I'm not going to go sort of, I don't want to make this a one-on-one Q&A, but it seems to me what many of you, the points that have been raised in a whole series of different ways, have pointed to the difficulties and the contradictions around which questions of imperialism, you know, don't solve problems. I think what they do is they offer a way of reframing. And the question then is how to reframe. And the point that Tara just raised, I think, was an interesting and important one. And of course, Stephen Friedman's work on Zionism, I think, is very important and needs to be sort of recognized in all of this. When he really, I think, does a very comprehensive job of taking apart claims about democracy. Yeah. But those very same claims about democracy can be reworked, yeah, and have wider resonance. And for example, what is going on in India under Modi is, it seems to me there's a great deal that activists in India could learn from what's going on in Palestine, Israel, for example. So, just more broadly, it seems to me the whole question of how a framing that keeps global interconnections in view, while at the same time recognizing historically specific forms that they take, but refusing to see these struggles as separate, of always searching for the interconnections, is really crucial. The whole question of race, religion, resistance is also something, it seems to me, the left has not been willing to take on nearly seriously enough. And we absolutely have to, yeah? And the question of how we do that, it seems to me, again, very important to think about historically and comparatively, but in ways that focus on interconnection. And, as I think it was Lara
that's
and
right. Samir.
And Samir was also making some of these points about the profound difficulties in dealing with these questions of fundamentalist religious nationalisms, but sort of recognizing them for what they are, as historically produced, rather than some sort of natural, eternal, direct line to divinity.
Right. Okay. I would love to deal with this issue a little more, but perhaps we can come back to it. I have a few views as well, Dale. We might not get a chance now, but perhaps after this we can chat about it. But let's give Jairaj a chance.
I'm just picking up on the point you made about British imperialism and the way that it selected both South Africa and Israel as the sites for settler colonial projects. South Africa is said to protect its sea routes to India, and Israel for the land bridge across, I guess, to India as well. Both of them had a kind of strategic, geopolitical, strategic benefits for the British Empire. But since that time, a lot has changed. The British Empire has kind of waned, and the US Empire has risen.
Yeah.
What is the role now in the current period for Israel to have such a strong support from the USA? We're seeing Joe Biden give them support to the extent that he's even possibly jeopardizing his own electoral prospects in the near future. Why is this so important for them? What's their role? The only thing that I can think of is, again, and the Houthis have pointed this out, the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, and the risks to global supply chains that not having control over that poses, makes Israel still geopolitically very important. Is there something else to it?
Well, you know, I mean, in addition to those geopolitical questions, I think the point you raised about, you know, why is it that that Biden goes ahead and, you know, continues to send arms to Israel. But, you know, it seems to me one of the very interesting and extremely significant things that's going on in the US now is, in fact, the student movement. And the student movement has really shaken up and sort of underscored the tensions within Judaism in the US. Because, you know, as with South African Jews for a Free Palestine, a lot of the students supporting the Free Palestine movement in the US are Jewish. And, you know, one of the things that the students at Berkeley did, but I mean students all over were doing, was when they set up their encampment, they had a Seder. And, you know, this, so I think, you know, and these are very significant, important moves, precisely because they pull the foundations out from under the anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. And that politically, one cannot, I don't think you can overstate how important that is in a US context. Yeah? But it's important in a European context as well. And I mean, what Germany is doing now is an outrage, an absolute outrage. And, you know, that is where, as I say, I think these student movements are very, very significant. And that this is, you know, talking about connected struggles, this is where students in different regions of the world need to be sort of connecting with one another and trying to make the connections between what's happening in their own countries and what's happening in Israel, Palestine. And that sort of interconnected politics that is attentive to history is, you know, holds out at least a small window of hope. It's a very small one, but nevertheless, I do think it's what we are seeing in the US is a calling into question of support for Israel that for a very long time has been off limits and is now seriously being called into question. And it may well be what propels Trump into the White House. I mean, that's the horrible irony of this whole thing. Yes. And the contradictions that, you know, that different people have pointed to, and the dangers that we have to be aware of.
Any more questions? Please go ahead, Tasneem.
Thank you. There's another comment online from Jennifer Casolo. Vis-a-vis the last comment of Tara, it was a little while ago, on Gilmore and using the mismatch. In the 80s, Mexico's open door and support of Central American anti-imperialist struggles mismatched its crackdowns on local activism. Zapatista organizing emerged in relation to those contradictions.
Okay, very good point. Okay, yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure how useful this is. This is more me thinking through like the argument. So is the argument that the concept of apartheid is limited in a strategic sense too, beyond just, and that it's insufficiently attentive to the imperialist legacies. If we just focus on Israel as an apartheid state, that we're missing key actors, key horizons of struggle, or key historical dimensions that have produced what we're witnessing today. I guess putting it another way, are there dangers in losing apartheid as the central mobilizing, because, and then relatedly, when comparing that like early 20th century South Africa, early 20th century Palestine, you know, the argument has been made by historians that apartheid was essentially just colonialism continued in a different form. But understanding then, and this sort of draws in the concept of the sub-imperialism and all of this, understanding apartheid as something decisively new from the 1950s, and understanding Israel as something not in terms of its like roots and everything, but in terms of its, say, modalities. It's, you know, the point has been made of dressing itself up as a democracy. Maybe the Bantustan strategy is something quite decisively new in the, and so maybe my question preempts your book in some ways, like, what's the next conjuncture, right, of like taking those, yeah, that's a scatter shot. Like,
No, very good question.
Yeah,
I was just thinking.
Did Melanie, are you?
To respond to that? Yeah.
No, not necessarily to respond, but to add. Because I don't want to lose the fact that Tara was very explicitly bringing in racial capitalism. And Roshan, when you said you don't know why you agreed to do this, I think it's because you made such a crucially important point, right? Which is that once we bring in anti-imperialism, then it raises all of these questions of what form does that anti-imperialism take? And I think, you know, when we stick with the apartheid analogy, which is profoundly useful, and Roshan, I think that's another one of the key contributions you were making. We cannot deny the incredible power of that analogy and the point that it's brought us to, right? With the South African government, with all of its hypocrisy, taking forward this case. And I love the point that Jennifer Kosolo was making, and you know that we were bringing in from Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore about how can we use that strategically within South Africa. But that I think, you know, to bring in Ruth Wilson-Gilmore again, you know, if we talk about abolition, right? Abolition isn't about getting rid of something, it's about what happens the next day. And what are we building towards? And I think that's the point that, you know, Roshan introduced that Laura picked up on. How do we, in a sense, it's becoming easier to build a coalition against genocide, although it still has to expand. But what comes next, right? And I think that we can't lose sight of the fact of the offshore gas, right? And the capitalist interests, right? So it's this articulation of the settler colonialism, of the imperialism, of the apartheid, but of the racial capitalism. And I don't have any answers, right? But in terms of what we do with that, as our comrades from the US were saying, it's very difficult, you know, to build coalitions that are anti-imperialist, that are also anti-capitalist, but that's the work we need to be doing. So I mean, that's partially what I understand Jill's intervention to be about, but also Roshan and Tara's and Salim's, and I think that's the challenge for us here in South Africa, right? Because as Dale was saying, people didn't want to acknowledge the ANC was rabidly neoliberal and capitalist. And because we didn't take those things on, we sit with this mess that we have now, right? And so these are the challenges that we have in organizing, but acknowledging how deeply, deeply difficult it is to build a coalition against apartheid. It becomes even so much more complicated. So there's no answers, but I think this is the provocation. and the challenge to us as activists. And what I love about this discussion here is the way it's throwing the ball back at us. You know, in South Africa, how do we take this moment and use it to advance our struggles here, and what work do we need to be doing around that?
Exactly. Tara or Roshan, do you want to come in?
I just have a question
Yeah.
about calling it Palestine, Israel. Because as activists, we call it Palestine
Or
as the land, or occupied Palestine, and refer to Israel as apartheid Israel, or genocidal Israel, or the Zionist entity, or 48 territories. So I just wondered why you'd called it like that.
You know, Roshan, it's an interesting question, and I think perhaps it has a lot to do with living in the US, where it's very difficult not to name Israel, because it is so pervasive. So I've done a kind of a workaround by saying Palestine/Israel. But also, you know, in the more historical part, I mean, what I see my contribution as being is around the more historical part, which is squarely around Palestine. Yeah? So, you know, when I gave the first, I haven't been working on this for very long. I started in October, and I gave a talk at Historical Materialism in London in November. And a very interesting group of young Palestinian activists came up and said to me, "Don't name Israel." Yeah. And I've struggled with that because, as I say, working in the US, it's hard not to. But, you know, this is I think is an interesting discussion, yeah? And clearly an important one.
Yeah. Okay, look, there are a number of people in this room. I see Fatima, I see Roshan Kader. She's still here, or maybe she is here and I don't see her for a particular reason. Oh, okay. And others, Tara, Roshan. You know, perhaps we should also talk about the Palestine Solidarity Movement, which is not a monolithic one. There are different views, etc. And I think it would be important. And there are people on the left in the movement, but there are also religious people, etc. And it's a constant battle precisely about these issues and much more. And I think it's very important, this discussion we're having, because sometimes we don't have it. We do in our own groups, but not between groups, for the sake of keeping the movement together in light of the genocide. It's always something we're pushing against, you know. So if a discussion comes up, to give you one example, about women in Iran, as you mentioned, or LGBTI, etc. We don't shirk away from that. We raise it. We get Palestinian feminists, we get Palestinian LGBTI people, Israeli LGBTI people, and we encourage people in the solidarity movement to discuss and debate this. Sometimes that costs the donors, maybe some Muslim businessman withdraw. You know, this is the risk. But it's our duty to connect the different struggles. And so constantly we are doing that. But I just want to say another thing. There's a fundamental difference between South Africa and Israel, occupied Palestine, and which has an impact on strategy, tactics, etc. In the sense that when we talk about racial capitalism in this country, you know, the rapid accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few white capitalists was at the expense of the black working class, which was needed, couldn't be expelled, couldn't be killed off. And it's different there. Palestinians are facing a genocidal onslaught, and it was just because of their resistance that they didn't fade away. They've been trying to do this since 1947. You know, that is one of the differences. Another point which is related to some of the discussions is, in modern world history, there are certain moments where humanity is galvanized. Was the case with the Spanish Civil War, with the support for the people of Indochina, Vietnam, Southern Africa, and it brought people together throughout the world, diverse groups, faith-based, trade unions, etc. And this is the moment we find ourselves in. And within that moment and the different forces at play, very disparate forces, we have a role to play as progressive people, as left people. It's not easy. And you know, while people were mobilizing in solidarity with us or Southern Africa, there was also Pol Pot. So an argument could have been made that Pol Pot is worse than the apartheid regime, and surely, in terms of the numbers of people killed, that regime was worse. But that wasn't why people felt it was important, because of the links. I mean, Pol Pot was already, you know, they weren't involved in the world economy or American imperialism or anything. They were divorced from that. South Africa was an important part of American imperialism, and therefore galvanizing people could assist the struggle against global capitalism as well. I think, you know, Adam Hania has written quite a few things precisely on this. And I remember this one line: it's not the depth or the length of the Palestinian struggle, but its place in fighting, in resisting what capitalism is trying to do. So the Palestinian role in the region, historically supporting progressive people, struggles in the Middle East, is something one has to consider as well. And I think in our country, certainly in the PSC, almost every one of our members are involved in anti-xenophobia work or LGBTI work or anti-racism. This is what we expect. It's not the same with all groupings who, in fact, raise this in the BDS coalition. We are united on Palestine and don't bring to the table other issues. And we always push back against that. So certainly Palestinian solidarity, as far as I know, doesn't divorce itself from other struggles. We try and make the links. In Africa, Israel plays a very important role in so many different ways, supporting warlords, creating wars, extracting minerals. You know, it's there, it's documented. And Israel plays a particular role under world capitalism today, or Zionism does. And therefore, it should be seen as an important, you can't be involved in other struggles. And, you know, it's like my friends in the state. They are involved in the living wage struggle, really important issues around climate catastrophe. By the way, there's an ecocide happening in Palestine as well, with tremendous consequences for climate catastrophe. And they involved in climate justice work, sexual reproductive work, rights, reproductive rights, and a whole lot of things, except for Palestine. The PEP thing, progressive except for Palestine. But that's now showing itself. And even those types are now questioning it. So, I mean, you know, Dale is the person who's always involved with Palestine, not just Palestine, Burma, Zimbabwe, and that's the way it should be. And we need people like Dale to constantly raise these issues. But I think we also need to understand the pivotal role of Zionism in the global scheme of things. There are differences, though. And I think what people like Andy Clarno, like Haida Eid, and they've written about racial capitalism there, it's a useful thing because it takes away the focus, you know, it puts the focus on capitalism and the role they play, because there's all other, and they can hide behind the anti-imperialists. People have been doing that forever, whether it's Saddam or the mullahs in Iran or the Zimbabwean elites, you know, they do this. They use other excuses. But there's also Islamophobia. I mean, we can't ignore the fact, but Islamophobia is used in a particular way to serve the interests of the very people we're talking about in order to dehumanize people. In the same way they dehumanize the Vietnamese or the people in Southern... Anyway, that's enough. Sorry. This was fantastic. The conversation has not ended. We must continue this. It helps us tremendously, but it also helps us to explain what we are up against as solidarity activists. And, you know, people's suggestions, ideas, critiques are absolutely essential. So thank you so much. Thanks to the two respondents and absolutely Jill, it's always a pleasure to hear from you, to engage with you, and this is not the last time, but also thanks so much to Swap and Bridget with Wits Sociology, UJ Sociology, and you know, we constantly, there is, with neoliberalism and higher education, it's the branding, it's the ranking, it's the competition, and we're not very far from each other. So we're trying constantly to break that divide as well. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. If you've got the energy